Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Hall with the Institute for Emerging Issues, a nonpartisan public policy and convening organization at NC State University. I'm pleased to welcome you to the fourth episode in our Talent First Tuesday series and the second episode in today's doubleheader. Earlier this year, we held our annual Emerging Issues Forum that centered on growing the state's workforce with a focus on removing barriers for those who have historically, systemically, or a result of COVID-19 had difficulties connecting and engaging in the workforce. The forum featured thought leaders and community practitioners who shared their knowledge and experience on how best to address this challenge. We also had several breakout sessions that were extremely popular with participants, each focused on one unique, yet very much intersectional group that faces workforce barriers. The biggest complaint? Not being able to attend more than one discussion at the forum. And of course, not everyone was able to attend the forum. So in response, we wanted to revisit each breakout session and let you be a part of the discussion again or join us for the first time. Today, we've brought back some of our speakers to provide high-level data and discuss an initial set of recommendations and tactics to help support those with disability and neurodiversity connect and engage to good jobs. We have Oleksandr Movchan, PhD, Director of Data Analytics and Research with lead at the NC Department of Commerce. We have Toya Crichlow, Executive Assistant to our Secretary of Department of Commerce, Secretary Sanders. We have Chris Egan, Assistant Secretary for Employment and Inclusion, Vocational Rehabilitation Services at the Department of Health and Human Services. We have Beth Butler Fadel, a lawyer and Executive Director with Disability in North Carolina. And then we have joining us Morgan Crawford. She's Deputy Director of the North Carolina Business Committee for Education. She works closely with Caroline Sullivan, who has been with us at the forum. So after we hear from them, we'll stop recording and use our remaining time to share our collective ideas for how these recommendations could come to life in your communities or regions. Before we begin, I want to provide some background about how the recommendations and tactics came to be. So first, we received support from the U.S. Economic Development Administration and convened a task force comprised of those with systems expertise and individuals with current or recent lived experience in facing employment barriers. It was co-chaired by Dr. Annie Izod of the NC Works Commission and Philip Cooper, IEI practitioner in residence and workforce equity advocate with the Land of Sky Regional Council. In total, we had 65 task force members across 5 working groups. They met 4 times from September to November and identified a set of challenges that they wanted to work on. Their recommendations and tactics were further discussed and refined at our annual Emerging Issues Forum, and we'll be sharing some of those with you. There were also 7 cross-cutting themes, and I want you to keep that in mind during this discussion. So let's go ahead and put those on the slide. The first recommendation really focuses on ensuring that the resources available are not only easy to access, but relevant and created by those with lived experience. We want to ensure that there are comprehensive career pathways that meet the needs of businesses, but are also meeting the needs of underrepresented groups. And that takes time, intentionality, and collaboration to achieve. Third, let's make our job postings shorter, easy to understand and complete, and emphasize the key skills needed to actually do the work. Next, in order for people to consistently engage in their jobs, we need to acknowledge that there are systems that they rely on to make that happen, and we need to support the workers in those systems too. We need childcare providers, before and after school care, reliable transportation, healthcare workers, and so on. And overwhelmingly, we need to support community and workforce navigators that are serving as bridge builders and connectors. Next, we need to make it easier for our boots on the ground service providers to do what they do best, so they aren't spending all of their time on looking for and administering funds. And they need to be more flexible sources of funding to meet the needs of some of our most underrepresented workers. It's not one size fits all, and neither should the metrics be. Next, we shouldn't expect people to do this work alone. We can always be learning from one another and sharing our successes, and peer learning is a great way to accomplish this. And finally, proximity matters. By placing those with the trust of the community with the service providers, not only will the proximity make it easier for the individual to access services, it helps the advocates and providers better coordinate and problem solve in a timely way. So again, I am thrilled that you are all joining us today, and we're going to kick it off with some data. So I'm going to go and turn it over to our presenter from LEAD at NC Commerce, Oleksandr Movchan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Movchan, and I'm with Department of Commerce, Labor and Economic Analysis Division. And I will show you some data on individuals with disabilities in North Carolina. So, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, 1.4 million of North Carolinians have some form of disability, and slightly more female individuals have disabilities as compared to male individuals. So that's approximately 13.5% of total civilian population in the state. The Census Bureau, or its American Community Survey, they classify disabilities by the impact those conditions might have on basic functioning. For example, in North Carolina, nearly more than 700,000 individuals have some form of difficulty. Nearly 500,000 have cognitive difficulties, and so on. Some have hearing difficulties, vision difficulties, and that's how ACS classifying this data. And of course, a mental or a physical disability can be a barrier to a success in the workforce. If you look at the employment rates, 65% of all adults who do not have disabilities are employed, as compared to only 25% of individuals with disabilities. Participation, also very different. 69% of all adults who do not have disabilities are in the labor force, as compared only to 28% of people who have some form of disability. Well, as good as it is, census data is based on the survey, on a survey of sample of households. And in North Carolina, we have another source of data that can help us to see the picture. We can follow a cohort of more than 670,000 students who graduated from public high schools in North Carolina between 2000 and 2010. And from that cohort, 51,000 students have reported as having some form of disability. So the advantages of this data is that unlike American Community Survey, it's not a sample, it's a population. So that's a population of all high school graduates who graduated within 10 years from all public schools in the state. Another advantage, this picture tells you what will happen in the future, because those kids are forming our future employment landscape. Finally, all of those disabilities are documented. They're not self-reported. So as you can see, the largest category is SLD, specific learning disability, and this is an umbrella category that includes dyslexia, dysgraphia. Now, let's again talk about workforce challenges for those kids. So we saw differences in the employment rates a few slides before. So let's talk about earnings. We can take all of those students who graduated from high schools 10 years ago and link their wage, their real wages reported by Division of Employment Security. So individuals with disabilities who found jobs in North Carolina tended to earn slightly more immediately after the high school for about 4 years. However, something has happened around this time. The wages for individuals who have disabilities started to fall behind after the 5th year after the high school. And then we subsequently see a gap in earnings that grows larger and larger each year. So as you probably can assume, this, well, at least part of this disparity can be explained by differences in higher education attainment. College students who typically work on their college degrees within about 4 years typically are employed part-time or are not employed at all. So let's verify this. Let's verify educational attainment for students who have disabilities and who do not have. So first, let's take a community college level. About 30% of all state high school grads will pursue a credit level, two-year degree in community colleges. And 9% of them will receive a degree from community colleges, as compared to only 23% of students who do have disabilities, and only 5% of those will graduate. What about four-year university system? Students who do not have disabilities, 1 out of 5 high school graduates will be enrolled in the state public university, and 19% of them will receive a bachelor's degree. With disabilities, the situation is very different. Individuals with disabilities have much lower levels of enrollment and much lower levels of graduation from a four-year institution. And this explains this gap. 4 years after high school, that's when the college degree starts to pay off, and students with disabilities do not have often that advantage. Now, let's take a look at some other statistics. Individuals with disabilities are overrepresented in the prison system. This disparity is rooted from so-called a school to prison pipeline that traps young people with disabilities in a cycle of disadvantage, misconduct, punishment, and leads eventually to incarceration in the adult correctional system. 12 years after the high school, nearly 8.7% of students with disabilities have a chance to end up in prison, as compared to only 3.7% for kids who did not have reported disability in high school. Well, to be honest, this disparity in incarceration rates is also preceded by a disparity in high school graduation rates. So if we separate data by students who graduated and who did not graduate high school, we will see very different pictures. Still, individuals with disabilities who dropped out of school still have much higher chances to be in prison within 12 years as compared to their counterparts who dropped out but did not report any disabilities. Well, and typically we talk about individuals, well, at least in this report, I was generally talking about individuals with disabilities as a group who are represented in prison. Incarceration rates also vary widely by the type of disability. Those who have behavioral or emotional disorders were the most at risk. Nearly 25% of them entering the prison within 12 years. And other categories have very, very different rates of ending up in prison. So we have to be very careful when talking about the general disabilities. And Sarah, now can turn back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Oleksandr. I did want to go back to your slide on education. You cite college going rate for those within the UNC system. Do you have data for private schools as well?
No, unfortunately, we do not have this data. It's only public universities.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And these data slides are available, and we'll be posting those in the chat. So now I'm going to turn it over and we're going to start our panel discussion. And I want to touch on something that, Oleksandr, your data does show, and I would say illustrates very well, is of the 5 groups that we really explored with this task force: transitioning military families, justice involved, opportunity youth, and families with young children. I would say that those with disabilities came up and touched multiple groups. So when we talk about our task force report and finding that, a lot of these recommendations and these groups are very intersectional, I think this is really one of those groups where we see that quite often. So I'm going to go ahead and briefly go over some of the recommendations, and then I'm going to lead us in a conversation. So if we want to go and pull up those slides, first I want to say that our task force was not an all-encompassing task force. These folks came together, about 10 or so folks that made up the work group, which you'll hear from some of them this morning. we only met over 4 meetings, some in person, some virtual. And the idea wasn't to come up with every last recommendation or tactic, but was to really focus on a couple of key challenges and some recommendations and tactics that we know that we could be lifting up for more of this general audience. So again, not all encompassing, but where we think that we'd be ripe for some upward momentum. And those challenges really fell into 3 categories. So the first 2 are listed here. So the first being about bias, really, and how we view folks with disabilities and neurodiversity. So the recommendation was really to foster this employment first mindset, which is getting a lot of attraction, and starting it much earlier. So the more that we are putting the individual first, their needs first, integrating and inclusion, the more successful we will be by the time they enter the labor force. We'll talk about that some more in just a moment. There was also this idea that employers need workers, right? I mean, we still have far too many job openings for those that are applying. So we know that there is a demand for workers, and we know that there are folks with disabilities that are able to work, that are quite skilled and able to participate in the workforce. And it's just more about creating those industry partnerships. I think that was something you mentioned all the time. It's about these partnerships with businesses to ensure that we're really building this supportive, more comprehensive ecosystem. And if you look on the next slide, just making sure that they have sort of these wraparound supports. And Morgan, you're going to talk a lot about some of what the supports look like in your program. But making sure that we're providing wraparound services to ensure that the needs of the person with the disability is being met. So that could be anything from, transportation, if someone has a visual disability, all the way to making sure that we've got coaches and those who understand the needs of those with disabilities, but also understand the workforce system, and having more certified job coaches that are providing that guidance along the way. So again, I'm not going to read through every single one of these recommendations because you'll all have access to those. But let's just go ahead and dive in. And first, I'm going to say that at the forum, this was the one breakout session that I did have the benefit of attending. And what really struck me was how the conversation quickly went to the folks in the audience who were sharing their personal stories about loved ones, so their children and whatnot. And Mother's Day was just on Monday. And so Toya, I want to start with you because you are a mom of someone with a disability, and you have had to become a parent advocate really early. And one of the things you shared with me was just intervention and how important that early intervention is. So maybe we could start with sharing as much of your experience as you're comfortable, and then maybe talking about one of the recommendations that really stood out to you, or another need or challenge that maybe didn't get lifted up that you think is really important for us all to know.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. So yes, to your point, I do have lots of experience with as a mom with a child on the spectrum. And I can tell you that the early intervention services that my family received are invaluable. These were services that were offered through the Methodist Home for Children. They have the Jordan Center is where my son was enrolled, let's say somewhere just before his 2nd birthday. I did not know that this center would have these services. I did not know that the center was going to be geared to serve as a training center for other facilities. What I knew was that I was a single mom with a full-time job, and I desperately needed quality childcare. What I discovered was I noticed that he had a speech delay. Did not know what it was attributed to, but I was sent to the Developmental Evaluation Center where he received a documented diagnosis of autism, but we received no direction, support, or guidance as to how to address his needs. Fortunately, because he was enrolled at the Jordan Center and they were already on top of the need for early intervention, they had what was called an autism project housed within that center. He immediately began receiving services. This took the weight off of me. I didn't have to do the research. I didn't have to discover on my own what autism was. They had professionals at the ready to receive him and to guide me. This was, again, at a child care center. So before he even entered kindergarten, we already knew what his needs were. we had already discovered and developed an individual educational plan. And to this day, that plan still follows him. Kai has graduated from high school with presidential honors. Last spring around this time, he earned a Bachelor of Science degree from the School of Agriculture at North Carolina A&T. And then in August, embarked on a graduate studies program. So he has just completed his first full year of graduate studies. And as of last night, received his final grades where he earned straight A's. So I cannot stress how important it is for families who are not only in need of quality childcare, but the childcare that offers or provides early intervention services so that they can wrap their minds around what a diagnosis is, what it means for their individual child, how to support them as a family. I can tell you that having those services allowed me to move forward through his education plan, knowing what he was capable of, what we were able to provide for him, and where the gaps were. I have met families that weren't as fortunate as me, and their children were diagnosed much later in their childhood. So we're talking about during grade school, it was discovered that the child had autism. But by that point, they're not only contending with the structure of autism and what it means for them to learn on a level that allows them to be successful, but they're also coping with the lack of attention that they received prior to that diagnosis. So you're not only diagnosing a child with autism, but by that point, there's a little bit of depression as well that's incorporated. So that parent or that family is now tasked with this introduction to a disability. They're also trying to contend with the guilt of missed diagnosis for years. Then they're trying to figure out how this child can matriculate through school and then what their adult future looks like. That's a lot to put on, that's a lot of emotional pressure to put on a family. And so I want to kind of reinforce the need for early intervention to be re-entered into childcare at that level so that families and children are given the best opportunities that they have available. I started to kind of brain dump a little bit and talk about some of the benefits that I experienced from that. And those, again, include just knowing what individual needs my son had academically and how best to address those. And I can tell you that while we didn't have the red carpet rolled out to us, there was a lot of creative thinking that needed to take place. And I had to get creative about where I sought and received those resources. But at least I had a solid starting point and knew that there was someone who could speak to the fact that he could be successful if we just gave some attention to speech development and how to cope with tantrums, because he was nonverbal when he was diagnosed with autism. So the only way he could communicate was through acting out. So once we focused the attention on increasing his speech capacity, he was able to then communicate in a healthy way, get his needs met, and also create an understanding for his educators as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I appreciate you sharing that story. And first of all, congratulations. I know you must be one proud mama to share that story. Our recommendations for this task force didn't really focus on the early intervention piece. We did have a families with young children that really did focus on childcare supports. But I do think that's important because you as you mentioned, that took some of the pressure off of you, and as a mom, as an adult in the workforce, that probably allowed you to also focus on your career. And now you do have kind of a big deal sort of job right now. And so, that's working for the Secretary of Commerce. And so, we do need to be thinking about not just the individuals themselves in the workforce, but also the parents and caregivers of those with disabilities. So thank you for that. And we look forward to hearing from you a little bit later later this morning. Now I want to turn it over to Morgan. So Morgan, a lot of the work that the Business Committee on Education is doing, you're supporting all students across North Carolina, but recently you started to focus more on certain groups like those with autism. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you're all doing? And we love stories here. So, share some stories. And then if there are any recommendations that really stood out to you about what we could be doing across North Carolina.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me here today. And so the North Carolina Business Committee for Education and CBCE, we are housed in the Office of the Governor. We're a business-led education nonprofit. So just that brief background. And back in 2018, 2019, we formed a collaborative. Some who were here today, like Chris Egan, part of that, but with the not just NCBCE and the Office of the Governor, but with State and Human Resources, with the Council of Developmental Disabilities, the Department of Health and Human Services, Vocational Rehabilitation, Capital Area Workforce, also UNC Teach Autism Center, and the Autism Society of North Carolina. We are very fortunate in North Carolina to have high quality autism service providers. The UNC Teach Autism Center is celebrated their 50th anniversary this past year. So long history in North Carolina of autism support. Won't get into that, but basically what the collaborative did was we pulled our resources and worked together to really connect with, we had the business connections, vocational rehabilitation, the funding and the support, the Autism Society of North Carolina, UNC Teach, the job coaching providers, but to provide early career individuals with autism, not just a foot in the door. First you got to open the door for the job to happen, and really thinking about everyone working to their highest potential. So a lot of people, even when employed, a lot of people with disabilities are underemployed. So those employment numbers don't just represent employment, but some of them, while employed, they're not, I guess as Oleksandr showed, a lot of the salaries aren't as high as they could be. A lot of people with degrees, not just associate's degrees or undergraduate degrees, but master's degrees and doctorate degrees are not employed. Some of those barriers, you mentioned one of them, simple job postings and the job responsibilities. Do you really need public speaking for some of these jobs? Do you need to lift 50 pounds? Those are two minor examples, but do we need all 25 things, or can we just really focus on the 5 critical ones? Also link it through this process. So what we do is we work with employers, whether it's state and local municipalities or private sector, and work on the interview process. Then, and it looks different for everyone. So as they say with autism, if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. So you can't say, oh, this is how you're going to tweak your interview process, and then that works for everyone. So it's really an individualized headhunter matchmaking experience, really, for the individuals to match the skills, the interest, and the capabilities with the employer. And then once they're in this internship or on the job training apprenticeship, then the job coach stays with them. And the funding, typically it's the employer who is funding this. We really encourage employers to have that buy-in and that they're paying the individuals. In some instances, vocational rehabilitation funding will kick in, like it can and will. But we find that the most success is when the employer has that buy-in. And then the goal is to transition to full-time employment. Sometimes the student's still in school, and so they'll go back to school, but really they have those work-based learning opportunities and that experience. Not just that, I'll mention briefly it's equity is not just getting your foot in the door, but it's allowing the opportunities to move up the ladder. So last year, through the governor's office, did the CARES Act, which provides for state employees with autism spectrum disorder to provide job coaching for those current employees so that they can receive support if they need to transition within the workplace and seek promotions and support on that level. So that was something that we were really excited about, that pilot program. It's been successful, and I believe it should continue. So that's a little bit of brief overview about Linkit and something that the North Carolina Business Committee for Education does. Super quick, and then I'll wrap up. But speaking to what Toya said about early childhood, we have also an exciting initiative with funding from DHHS with the early childhood youth apprenticeships and getting young, not just young, it could be a returnship, it could be, anyone along the career into being a child care provider, working with child care centers, working with not just the high level of education, but with identifying individuals with special needs. Because you just heard her personal story there of how great that was.
Great. Well, thank you, Morgan. And we'll come back to the Linkit program too, because there's some conversation that we had during the forum about, self-identifying in order to be able to benefit from some of those programs. And so when we start to get into some more of that inclusion conversation, maybe we could come back and hear your thoughts on that. So we've heard, you mentioned a couple of times vocational rehabilitation. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you because your department does a lot of work to support workers. And I know we could probably do just an entire episode just hearing about all of the different things that your group does. But when it comes to workforce specifically, tell us a little bit about what you do and how you're supporting efforts to remove those barriers.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone, for the opportunity to be with you all again. It really is a big topic, and it's hard to figure out where sometimes to focus that time. Let me give a quick shout out, Toya, to you. I'll just say personally, going on 22 years ago, when my wife and I had twins, my daughter was born with significant medical challenges, and early intervention was absolutely key in the early stages of looking at opportunities to help her address and help us address what her needs would be, medical conditions, but also the therapies to be sure that she would keep up developmentally, and she has. She and her brother graduated from ECU last year, both with undergraduate degrees and working and successful. And it's that notion of high expectations, of opportunities, of thinking about how to advocate. And I think that's really something that parents, as well as the professionals, and frankly, the other networks in the lives of families need to focus on first. And that is, sometimes it's hard to lay your hands on or recognize where resources are. Sometimes they're not easily visible to you. We have to do more to be sure to share information about the services provided by vocational rehabilitation, information about services provided through our local management entity managed care organizations and through the provider services available. And the earlier we can start, the better. We'll use our North Carolina home and community-based waiver for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So many families don't realize that's there, and by the time they do, they end up on what would be considered a registry of unmet needs in order to then hopefully get in the queue for services. Another side item I'll mention now, and then I'll jump into more information about vocational rehabilitation is, from a workforce standpoint, not only do we need to raise awareness and create avenues sooner and make sure the funding is there for that, and that we're dealing with waiting lists because the needs are there. But the other is, if we look at the crisis we have out there, and this was mentioned earlier, I think, Sarah, you mentioned this, and Morgan, you too, and others, and that is the salaries that we pay folks who are working in this space in a supporting role. And we are struggling mightily to fill positions in order to provide the support services to someone with support needs in order to get to work or to get around their community. Our salaries are too low, the vacancy rates are going up. And so I think these are some big system issues that while we may have avenues and the skills and the desire, and frankly, I think the vision now to continue to move forward with expanding choice and opportunity, we're struggling on the infrastructure side of this, and that's not getting any better. And perhaps as we continue to think about, we have this untapped workforce of individuals with disabilities, that's part of the answer. So as Oleksandr mentioned earlier, probably about 1 in 5 people in the nation have a disability. If you're not born with it, you may acquire it at an earlier age, or you may, as you get older, develop a condition. So I think we have to recognize that from a framework standpoint, and from the challenges that we highlighted earlier, disability is natural. It's a part of our human condition. It's something that we think about now differently than we ever have, but we're still overcoming a lot of historical bias with this notion of low expectation, or even stereotypes about what we think people can and can't achieve. So from a VR standpoint, vocational rehabilitation in our state, when you think about VR, I want you to think about 2 things. We're not a combined state in terms of 2 big VR vocational rehabilitation support system. One is the Division of Services for the Blind, and that division focuses on employment supports, but also medical eye care and other supports and developmental efforts for individuals who are blind or have low vision or deafblind. And then the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, which serves people across the disability spectrum in a way that helps people to on a pathway toward employment. And we can provide a range of supports. And in fact, we often, for someone with more complex support needs, we have strong collaborations with Morgan and with other entities inside the state government, but also with our private providers such as Teach and other community rehabilitation providers across the state in order to provide more day-to-day employment supports on that pathway and help ensure some success in that transition. I would say that at this point in time, the best thing that can happen for a young person while they're in school is to be sure that expectations are high. Well, you mentioned that, have to start with that. And also begin to think about how to be sure to connect with vocational rehabilitation as soon as possible. We start serving people at 14 years old. And the best thing is to start looking at developing an employment plan as early as possible. I would love to see that age start earlier, and I think we can see that other systems can start that process, but VR at 14 begins. And under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, we are mandated to invest in youth, to have a pathway from school into employment, competitive employment, or at least continue on in education, and then just to be supported to gain employment later. As you know, there's other priorities that are aligning. Governor Cooper signed Employment First Executive Order in 2019 that was mentioned earlier, which really sets the notion that anyone, regardless of disability, should have the opportunity for full participation in integrated employment. And we think about employment, that choice should be there. Doesn't mean everybody will want to be, but we should be focusing on the fact that regardless of the support needs, if someone wishes to be employed, that we are in a position to be able to provide those supports for that to happen. We also know that with the graying of America, we're seeing a change in the workforce. We also are experiencing some of those barriers here in the department. We're at around 27% vacancy rate. The Division of Vocational Rehabilitation hovers in that same range. So we're working very hard to figure out how to increase our own diversity when it comes to employees, as well as finding other levers we can pull to attract in employees into VR. Our department focuses on behavioral health and resilience at the departmental level with Secretary Toya Crichlow, child and family well-being, and building a strong and inclusive workforce. And employment is a key expectation and outcome of each of those priorities. So we also have some additional areas of emphasis that we're focusing on, including expanding choices for people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities to have greater choice in employment. If we look at the some pressure that we have from the Department of Justice, we're focusing on individuals, greater supports through a really unique and exciting model of individual placement and supports for someone with, again, behavioral health or mental health support needs to move from a more congregate setting, such as long-term care settings where someone may be living back into their community, into apartment life as well as a job. Those two go hand in hand. So these are things that we're growing. The collaboration within the department and with the private sector is probably stronger than I've ever seen in 30 years. And there's a lot of interest and intent at the General Assembly to look at how we can address these barriers. And that in big part is because of the advocacy of individuals and families, as well as our provider community, highlighting the need and the issues. So there's just so much happening. Here's another example with this institute and the focus here, and with everyone presenting from different perspectives. So I think what we have to do now is continue to communicate these priorities, collaborate on those solutions, advocate strongly, and learn and spread information so that families, especially families with young children, but perhaps even those that haven't had a chance to touch this system, have a better understanding of what's available, what the challenges will be, but what the opportunities are. So there's a lot more I could talk about, but I think I'd went over my time by double. So I'll stop with now. Thank you.
No, that's wonderful. Some really great themes that I'm hearing. But we're going to turn it over to you. And you were one of the first people that I talked to when we were putting this task force together. And I'm just so grateful for a couple of reasons. One is that you really helped challenge my thinking about sort of what inclusion looks like. And you are an amazing dot connector, just connecting the dots, and clearly put a lot of time and intentionality into partnership, particularly with the businesses you work with. So tell us about the work that you do and what, for those of us that are listening that maybe are more of that risk averse, I don't want to do the wrong thing. Tell us what your message is for those folks.
So we're excited about this conversation. I could just sit here all day, and I think we probably tried to when we met the first time, is just the excitement around this work, because for many, many years, I think all of us, right, have been waiting for the time for the business and the private and public sectors to kind of come together and have really meaningful conversations around employing people with disabilities. And so it's exciting to just be on this panel and listen to the experiences of my colleagues around this work. From an employment perspective, I think what's important, at Disability in North Carolina, we really work to build that network, that business-to-business network. So when we talk about peer-to-peer training and education, our businesses are really doing that. And that's the culture that we try and foster through our events and through our training. Is one way we can all listen and learn best from each other is those with the lived experience. And what's interesting as I sit here and listen to Chris and to Toya, these are individuals that have children with disabilities. They are also very accomplished in their work. So they are employees of organizations. And what we continue to impress upon our businesses, who often say, well, we don't hire people with disability. Where are they? They're not a part of our workforce, because at the beginning of their journey, they think that an individual with a disability is going to be in a wheelchair, right? Or have a service animal accompany them. And one of the first things, and I think, Sarah, you and I talked about this, right? 75% of people with disabilities have non-visible disabilities. And so I often share quickly that I am a person with a non-visible disability. So I received services from the the Division of Blind Services in South Florida, and then in Alabama when I went to law school, starting in third grade. And so looking at me, you wouldn't know that I had a disability. And so I challenge the employers that we work with to say, you do not know who you're talking to. at any given time in an interview or even a colleague in a conference room. So being aware of just that fact, that this whole idea that we think we understand what a person with a disability looks like, acts like, in the way that they contribute, we don't know. And so it's kind of kind of disassembling those ideas. But what I think I really appreciate as well is the importance of creating that ecosystem of services and supports for employers. At Disability in North Carolina, and you mentioned the dot connector, I'm always looking at ways that this work and this conversation around disability inclusion can be incorporated into conversations that we've continued to have routinely in the workforce area, right? So workforce development, for example, we have spent a lot of time partnering with the career service centers. When we think about job seekers and where they go to find supports around employment, unemployment benefits, care for their children, that type of thing. Job seekers with disabilities are included in that larger population. As I said, right, non-visible disabilities are the most prevalent. And so we've spent a lot of time working and training the areas of workforce development to say, think about that, right? So as you are working with job seekers, some of them may have disabilities. So that collaboration at that level with vocational rehabilitation and being aware of the services that are available to again, help those individuals at any point that they enter the system. And often that is what happens. An individual will have a job and then they lose employment. Maybe it is an accommodation. Maybe they find themselves in crisis and they don't have the resources and services available, so they're unemployed. And so it's really bringing that concept to the larger group to ensure that they know the resources that are available and start to connect those dots for those employees. At Disability in North Carolina, we are also very mindful of the importance of early connection, starting conversations early around employment. We are excited to have received a pre-employment training services grant this past year. And that is an area that is really opening up opportunities to connect our business partners to these young individuals, students that are still in high school, that are having conversations around career exploration, job exploration, what types of jobs are out there for these young people, and connecting them with these businesses as mentors to say, look, let's talk about the accommodations process. Let's talk about employee assistance programs and EAP programs that can help support the needs of these young people as they transition into their jobs and careers. These are conversations that haven't happened historically, at this young stage in their journey. And I think it's important. We're also connecting the dots at the college level. I know I look at the statistics around the employment rate among young people, like Toya's son, that are high achievers in college and graduate school, and yet they graduate and they move into careers that may not be lifting them up to the capacity that they can achieve. But some graduate to the couch still, even with a 4-year degree. And so we are working through our Communability Mentoring program to educate and connect career services with the Office of Accommodation Resource or Disability Support Services to create and connect business mentors to young people, young college students with disabilities. Why? Because we know that internships and apprenticeship opportunities happen through networking. And if these students are not connected with those opportunities intentionally, they fall to the wayside, and statistics tell us that. So it is important, and we've got the employers that are looking for that talent, that are coming to us saying, yes, we want to invest in time as mentors, and we want them to learn about who we are as employers, because we're coming on these college campuses regularly. We're having difficulty connecting with the college students or the graduate students with disabilities. And so to be able to kind of connect the dots for them and bring this conversation to the forefront on these campuses is a big part of an exciting part of what we're doing. So it's a journey, and we say it all the time, right? I wish it's a marathon, not a sprint, but I am very, very excited to just, again, feel the collaboration that's happening. And I do think it's real. It's real. Now, do we have it all together? Absolutely not. Do we still have systems in place that foster that low income for these individuals? Yeah, I think we do. So, it's a full conversation, but we're having the right conversations, I think, now, and asking the right questions. And I'm thrilled to be working alongside such passionate and well-educated and informed professionals in this space. So thank you. And thank you for the work that you all are doing.
Thank you, Beth. When we talk about employers who maybe are interested in potentially hiring someone with a disability, but maybe a little uneasy because of all of the unknowns, what would be the message that you would give them?
Yeah. So, we talk about this a lot, right? There's fear associated with what you don't understand. And so I think it's important to just step out and find a partner, right, that works alongside you. There is risk, and I will say this as an attorney, right? There is risk associated with any hire that you make today. Often you'll hear, well, there's what if it doesn't work out? What if I mess up? Well, I'm here to tell you, you will. You're going to make the wrong decision. But an individual, if you've created that culture that is inclusive, that authenticity, the resources and supports that are in place, that transformation happens, is very visible to employees with disabilities and to those that are willing to give you the grace that is necessary. We don't get it right every time, but it's that interactive conversation that allows for both individuals, whether it's the hiring manager and the individual with a disability, to talk about their needs. And our job is to really help build the confidence and the awareness around the importance of that conversation, and not feeling like you have to have all the answers, but having conversations that say, you know what, I want to be supportive as your manager. I want you to be successful, and so here, help us understand what tools you're going to need to make you feel to find success here. And sometimes it's very minimal, and most often it is. But I think that's an important, is take a deep breath and just take a step and hire an individual and open up that conversation within your organization.
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth. And that's where the business to business, the peer learning really does provide some support. Again, I want to thank Oleksandr, Toya, Chris, Morgan, and Beth for being with us today. The recorded portion of today's conversation will be available later today as a special episode of our Connected podcast. We will also share all of our Talent First Tuesday recordings on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. These links can be found on our website at emergingissues.org. Join us on May 23rd at 9 a.m. for the last episode in our series focused on opportunity youth, defined as 16 to 24-year-olds who are in school or in the workforce. And for more information, please go to emergingissues.org. Thank you all again. Enjoy the rest of your day. And until next time, let's stay connected.